Hey everyone, it's Nick. I got a tutorial for you today about VRay, which is a rendering plugin that we're using with Rhinoceros. There are different flavors of VRay for like things like Studio Max and Maya, Revit, SketchUp, lots of other tools. We're going to focus on how this plugin works with Rhino. As you notice, I have a cold, so hopefully that doesn't bother you guys too much. I'll do the best I can here. Um, so real quick, I just want you guys to kind of understand what the difference is between VRay and just a regular kind of rendering software. And in the other video, I talked a bit about what rendering kind of is and why we do it. But I just kind of want you to see kind of what I'm talking about. So if I go in and render the scene, and this is going to take a little bit because it takes time here. So this is what the scene looks like if I'm rendering kind of the default sun in in Rhino, and this is no plugins. This is just what Rhino gives me, and you'll notice right away, like I don't have any materials on it yet. I don't have any kind of a background. Um, I haven't really like adjusted a lot, but what you do get is you get the shadows, and the shadows are not like they're pretty solid in this case, and that's something I can kind of play with. But for the most part, you get these crisp kind of shadows with hard edges, and they're very dark. And you don't get a ton of detail. Like you're not able to really like resolve a lot. It does not look realistic. In fact, it doesn't even look good. But this is what we have. And when you're working with just like the default Rhino, I'll try to do another review here. I mean, this is just basically a way to get your project, out in a way to talk about it, and it's not intended to be really fancy. This one looks a little bit better. You can see some of the artifacts. And again, there are some things I can do to make this better, but this is more or less like what you're gonna get. It's not realistic, especially because the shadows are very hard. Just something that you don't usually get unless you have a really intense light source, and you're not getting any bounces of light, like I talked about in the other video about rendering. And so there it is, right? So keep this in mind. I keep this kind of situation, this kind of solution in mind for when I go into VRay. So you start with this file that I gave you. You can open it up, and the first thing you want to do is change your renderer to VRay, and that'll launch. It just says VRay for Rhino. Good. So when you're in VRay, if you don't have the plugin bars and you want them, you can just go to Shul Toolbar and just open up this VRay for Rhino, and just kind of here you go. And you can kind of tuck these things wherever you want them to live. You can float them off to the corner if you want, whatever. So those are your VRay, and everything is duplicated, up here in VRay as well. So here's where all your different tools live. And the first thing I'm going to do with VRay is open up what's called the asset editor. And it's available in this little icon. It's also just under this asset editor. And this is your kind of like nerve center. And I already have some stuff kind of in there, but we're going to go ahead and go right away to the settings. This is where we're going to do like most of our work. Your settings may not be the same as mine because I think it's using some of the defaults from the last time I used it. So let's just bear in mind like what the settings are and pay attention that yours match mine. First thing I'm going to do, if you have it on yours, I'm going to enable GPU acceleration. That's using the graphics processing unit to help render things faster. As you know, rendering is one of the most intense things you can do with your computer. Any little bit helps with it. We're going to go ahead and turn on the interactive render, and then we're going to go ahead and click on this, and then click this second one, which is the little teapot with the rendering finger on it, and that's going to open up the interactive renderer. And yours may look like mine, it may not look like mine, but don't worry about it. This is the interactive renderer, and you can see already, like we haven't done anything, but you can see the really high contrast, the range of contrast. You can see the kind of that you can identify the edges of things, whereas before the shadows got really dark and they had no definition. You can see actually how there's a bit of like a reflection from this shape into the shadow that kind of cuts it up. Pardon me. You can see it. I mean, that the shadows look a little bit different. If I zoom in, you can see a light bounce here. You can see how the light bounces off of that edge. There's just a lot more kind of light information going on. It looks kind of like a little physical model. It looks more real. And that's exactly what we're talking about with VRay. Like we want to try to experience things more architecturally, get a sense of the way light and materials work together, and the way the atmosphere, works with our project. It's just much more successful than the like, generic render that you get with your software. And this is true for most programs. Most programs um, will benefit from an additional rendering plugin, but of course that's more software to learn, more software to buy. In this case, though, the results you get with VRay are so good and in most cases so fast. It's really worth it for us, especially when we want to experiment with different design ideas and then make those final presentation renderings. So this is the frame buffer, and it's what the rendering. It's not a rendering, I should say. This is the interactive rendering, and to prove it, I'll just say that if we move around, it's going to render again interactively, and I think you understand the benefits of this are immediate. So this model I gave is just kind of like a generic model. Doesn't have a full site, doesn't have a lot of information. It has a couple of layers on it. If I open up the layers panel off to the side, it just has like glass, ground, and then this basic layer, which is the buildings for the most part. I'm not even sure it has a ground layer at the moment. Yeah, so something to think about. And then I have one camera. And as you guys saw in the email, the lesson is really going to be to set up your own cameras, set up your own views, really understand this project, but then make some renderings of it that really communicate different ideas about its form and its spaces. So right now, this isn't really perfect, right? Not really acceptable. So what can we do to improve it? First thing I'm gonna do is to try to get a sun in there because we want to really represent the sun. And to do that, I'm gonna go into if I go into this and go into the environment tab, I'm gonna click on this little checkerboard. Actually, I'm gonna check this box first, and then I'm gonna click on this little checker. This box basically so the environment background is a way of changing the environmental settings, and in this case, we're actually talking about the sun and the sky. That's our environment. This checkbox means it's turned on, and this bitmap, this little icon means there's a map. And a map is basically a two-dimensional graphic that we're going to use to convey information in 3D. In this case, it's a picture of a sky, for lack of a better term. So if I click on that, it takes me into this pull-out, and right now it says bitmap. I'm going to change that by clicking here, and then go to sky. You can see the immediate response in the rendering. You can see that you get this kind of haze, and what that is pardon me, that's naturally the way that the sky kind of is like as you get towards the edge of it, is that it does kind of get sort of hazy, and there's ways of kind of getting around that in your renderings, but for now, that's a representation of the way the sky looks for this particular time of day, and the way that the atmosphere interferes with it. So once you've got that sky turned on, you can go ahead and you can I just checked that. I think I need that on, but you can play with different things. So if you affect the input of that map, you can have that sky be affecting it more or less strongly. I would go ahead and have it go up all the way. You can do other things too, like if I change the size multiplier, I can increase the size of the map. And what that's going to do is it's going to tend to soften up those shadows. You can see the effect of that. And you have to kind of use your judgment depending upon the size of the model. Like if I had a city, I might go to a 5. If I had this building, I might go to a 2. And that just kind of introduces a bit of sort of indirect light to the edges of things, makes them a lot less crisp, which is what they aren't typically that crisp. And you can and the nice thing about that visual, editor again, that interactive render is I can experiment with that. I think right now it looks like a 2.5. You don't need to worry about these different sky models. I mean, if you want to play with them, you absolutely can. They're just different engines for calculating the sky. I personally don't really understand the math of them very well, but there you go. We go ahead in a moment, and kind of adjust some of the things. Ozone is the kind of level of particles in the air. Um, you can kind of look all this stuff up. And same with like turbidity. But if you go back and you can kind of adjust those. So there's like the amount of like particulate. You don't need to worry about that stuff. But again, experiment with it. You don't really need to mess with it though. I'm messing with it way more than you should. But anyway, just you get a sense of how this works. And then the albedo is the color of the light that is reflected off of the ground, more or less. And what you can do sometimes for outside is, as I would make that albedo kind of a light blue, and you can go in and just select a color and then kind of adjust it, here. And if you want to add it to your colors, you can. And that kind of, it's very subtle here, but that kind of lends it a little bit more realism, or can. I think that's pretty much all you want to do with that. The other thing is, once you've got that in there, you actually have a sun, and so you can type in sun and open up that sun panel. I'm gonna go ahead and close this one. Yeah, now I have a sun, and if you don't have it docked, you can just go and grab it and chuck it in your side here. And you can do different things, like if you wanted to just control the sun yourself, move it higher in the sky. You get effects like that. Now, I want to say this. So what happens? Like you like blew out. I mean, things are like super bright, right? Like it's extremely bright. You can see kind of the sun path. So yeah, be careful with these kinds of things. I'm gonna play with that for a second. Let me try to get it to a place where it's pretty washed out. Yeah, so you lose. Look at all that. You've like lost it. There's like this big bright hot spot. So what you can do with that though is remember that the computer is treating this like a camera, and so what you can do is you can change this exposure value just like you would with a regular camera. And so the lower numbers are going to have more exposure. They're going to open up that camera aperture more and let more light in. The higher values are going to let less light in. And you can see what you get, with that. Like when I get up to a 15, it's actually not too bad. And really between a 13 and a 15, at least for this scene, I think work like fairly well. You keep doing it, and eventually it's just you're not gonna let enough light in. It's gonna be too dark. So try to strike a fair balance. Like that's still too bright. And you can do it, pretty like numerically. So there you go. You can get something like that. But the other thing you can do is go back to take off manual control, and you can actually find a location. For example, Des Moines, Iowa, close to Ames, or wherever your site is. You can type in the latitude and longitude as well. And you can type in the time of day. So you could say, winter, 11 o'clock a.m., or I could say, like, middle of summer, and maybe 1 o'clock p.m. You get that kind of solstice action going. And you get it at night. It doesn't really do much for you. Right, so those kinds of things. And then as you notice, you get later in the day, there's a lot more color in the light, or as you get earlier in the day, it gets kind of orange, kind of yellow, a little bit. So when you're trying to represent the building though, or your space, or your project, you gotta think about the look. Make sure you get the north arrow correct. So in this case, it's 90 degrees. So if you're looking at the plan view, like 90 degrees is up. So that's typically what most of our projects will be modeled at. But you really got to be careful that that's correct, right? That your building's actually oriented correctly. Otherwise, these settings are not going to work. And then think about what time of day you want to show it. Like, do you want to show the light hitting it so you get these shadows? Shadow really helps you register the form of the building, right? It's not just about creating a pretty image, but it's also about kind of helping the people looking at your project understand the form of the building. So sometimes, like these magic hour kinds of things, where you get it really early in the day, really late in the day, are nice because they have these kind of longer shadows. But that's actually pretty good. So like, you want to try to avoid. I think most of the time, if you have a project and you're just showing it at noon when the light's more or less coming straight down, it's not always it doesn't have a lot of drama. Doesn't really help you read the project that well. So, and then as you do these, like I think you want to try to find a time and be consistent with that time across all the different renderings that you make of that object. Okay, I'm gonna try to get something slightly balanced here. Okay, more or less back to where we were. It's kind of a hot spot there, but that's fine. So pretty good contrast in the image. And that's kind of what I like. I like areas that are fairly dark, and I like areas that have like some that are pretty bright. But you can see what this is doing is really showing me that there's a negative space in here, and I like that. And that's kind of showing the wall from the courtyard, which is not too bad either. And I can keep playing with this forever, but it's kind of fun though. Yep, too much. Yep, probably had better before. The rendering is pretty like iterative, as I've talked about. Yeah, 15's not bad. Okay, so that's just kind of that. Now it doesn't have to be perfect right now because we're gonna do some things to play with the exposure of it in some other tools. We're probably gonna Photoshop it later. So you're just trying to get a good rendition, make sure that camera's working well. Then the next thing you want to do is go in and look at the materials. And if you go into the VRay editor, you can do a couple different things. I mean, the easy thing to do is go into the material list, make a new material. So you click this button, say generic, and you could call this walls or something for now. You go into that, go to quick settings. The diffuse color is the color of the object, and the reflection impact how much reflection they have. That's basically all that is. So even though it looks like a color, it's really about the intensity. Reflection is the amount that objects are reflected, and refraction is the amount that they're distorted. You can see that. You can play with these, but it's really not something that you want to mess with right now. The more reflection and refraction you have in your projects, the longer they take to render because it's calculating quite a bit. But in this case, I'm going to go ahead and I might make something. So that's like a generic material. If you just want to make something a color, and you want to play with these settings, the other thing you can do is take that and change it to something like a plastic, which already has some settings in there. And let's say we wanted to make this like a plastic model. You want to be sure not to make something all the way white because you really have to have areas for it to get brighter and areas for it to get darker. It's like a light gray, medium gray. If you want to go with white as a color, you're actually looking at that white gray or medium gray. So there's kind of a material that I made. I can right click it and I can say apply material to layer. So I can apply it to the basic layer. And that's immediately going to update that frame buffer. And you can see the reflections. You can see the effect of that. It's pretty glossy. Like it's kind of fakey looking. And if that bothered you, you could go in and start to dial some of these things back a bit, like dial back that reflection. It's pretty nice. It's pretty like interactive. I mean, you can make a project look like it's a little physical model that you made, but we just don't make buildings and whole places out of plastic, really. So the other thing you can do is if you want to instead of making your own material, you can go into the you can kind of open up this arrow, and then you can go in and find a material like, for example, glass, and then I can go through here, and just glass. I think let's see here, glass window neutral. Might be one, or glass water blue. You can use that, but you dragging that in there. And then again, I can right click it and I can say apply to layer glass. And you can see the effect already. So now those become transparent, because we didn't really have that before. You can also do something where like I could go in and there's like concrete. So I could go to this concrete layer. And there's like different things, and there's like A, B, C, D, M, I, J, whatever, all the different ones. And then it says 2 meters. So there's like reflective concrete. Let's do simple concrete. So drag it in here. Simple concrete, 2 meter, just means it's type A concrete, just of all, and they just look different. A, B, C, D all look different. 2 meters means it represents a 2 meter section of concrete, and that's what it's going to tile at. Remember, textures are flat and they get wrapped around 3D objects, and so if you need it to be a tighter, looser mapping, you can adjust that in the scene. I'll show you in a minute. So if I click on my scene, I can click on this kind of road. I might even, if I had asphalt or something like that, I could use that. And then if I right click it, I could say apply to selection. And now I have this concrete in my project. And then if I want to adjust the mapping of it, by which I mean the tiling, the way, the number of times you repeat the texture, you just go to the diffuse color, click on UVW. And UVW means, so in our space, it's XYZ. But in the computer, if you're within a piece of geometry that may not obey XYZ coordinates, or it needs its own coordinate system, and so what we use is UVW. And UVW just means XYZ space in that object. So it's basically XYZ. So, and I can repeat that tiling. So for example, if I wanted it to be smaller than 2 meters, I might tile it twice. So now it's 1 meter, or it might be half meter if I'm going to repeat it 4 times. And you kind of have to get the feel for it, but you can see the difference. And just if it looks like you took one picture and stretched it out over an area that's too large, you'll be able to tell in your rendering you need to adjust the tiling. And we'll talk more about this in the other video, but I just want to mention it. And then the other thing you do is go to the bump map. And the bump map is a black and white map that represents, it basically makes bumps, makes kind of 3-dimensional indentations, and you have to make sure that tiling matches the other map, otherwise it's going to look funky. And if I go in, and the more that you increase the bump map, the more you can kind of see that kind of grit. At least you should. I mean, if the light, especially when the light hits it, you're going to see it a lot more. I'm not really seeing it much in this. That doesn't mean it's not there. Okay, so that's the interactive, and that's not done. But I'm gonna go ahead and play with materials, play with lights, play with the cameras, and then once you're kind of ready to get something out, go back to the settings. You're gonna go into and turn off the interactive render, and actually just click. Yeah, there you go. So turn off interactive. I think you can leave progressive on. Well, let's not have progressive on. And then you can change the render output here to the size you want. And I'm not going to make it very big right now because it takes a long time to render for me on this machine. But this is very small. You're going to want a much larger image. I believe in the educational version you're limited to 1600 by 1200. That's pretty big. For these assignments, I might do something like 1024 by 768. And it'll automatically adjust that. These are pretty standard resolutions for things. Okay, so that tells you the size of it. And let's see if there's anything else I need to play with here. I don't think so. Let's make sure you're kind of satisfied with this. I might kind of play with my exposure a little bit first. You're not going to see it update, by the way, I guess, if I've already turned off interactive. And if you've changed a lot of things in the scene, your interactive renderer might not update. Like if you add a light, sometimes it doesn't work, so you might have to like start your interactive renderer back up again. But anyway, when you're ready to render, go ahead and you can click on quality here, and there's different outputs, and basically draft is like fast, and low quality, medium, high, very high, and for prints and things, you might. If it's a PDF, you might just go medium. If you're going to print it, you might go high, very high. But, again, the amount of time it takes to render something is going to increase exponentially. It's also going to increase with the more reflective materials that you have and the more, the more objects you have in the scene, et cetera, et cetera. So those are things that you're going to have to watch out for. I'm going to go ahead and do, I guess, like a medium render for this. And go ahead and click the teapot. And then the render is going to start. And you can see it breaks the thing up into little boxes. These are called buckets. And it uses each of your cores in your processor is rendering a bucket at once. And it's going to do more than one passes, which means it's going to render it once, and then it's going to like sample that, and then it's going to render it again. And if you are interested, you can read all the kind of gobbledygook that's going on in the progress window. But it's not really useful unless you run into a bug or something. But anyway, so it's going to render through this, and the quality is going to be noticeably better than it was when we just saw it in the interactive render. So here's one pass that just finished, and then the second pass is going to go in, and again, it's going to resample it. It's going to like remove the aliasing, which is the kind of blocky stuff, and then there you go. It doesn't take like super long. But you can see, like, I love those like shadows up there. You can start to see the kind of glass, showing up. You can see the kind of quality of that shadow of it. So that's not bad, but it's not like done yet. So to finish it off, you could do this in Illustrator, but there's some tools that are built into VRay that are quite nice. So I can click on this little icon here, and then I can go in and open up the exposure tab, and I can play with the exposure of the image here. And this is similar to that E value or that exposure value, but not quite. You can see I do this, but then I have this thing called highlight burn, and I can take out the highlight burn. For example, like where that kind of sunfall is there. So I can do those kinds of things. I can also just generally kind of increase or decrease. Now don't overdo it. I want to really stress that. Like if you make it, cartoony, right? I don't think we want that, either. So nothing, you just go to the white balance, and you can make an image like warmer or cooler. I think oftentimes, especially in exteriors, maybe up into the 7,000 range, you kind of have to play with this stuff. It's not kind of rocket science, but again, you want to kind of go for a good range of contrast, but not too much. You don't want to burn anything. You want to try to get some of that stuff back. So you can kind of play with those, and you can go all the way in. And these are all like the way they are in Photoshop, like where you can desaturate the image, or increase or decrease the lightness of it, and change the levels of it, that kind of thing. And so that's that can be kind of useful sometimes. When you're ready to go, when you want to export it, you just click on the save icon, and you should be able just to save it like right to your desktop or something like that. But that's pretty much it. So just I think actually, yeah. So if you just save it, I think it's a save channel, but I think that's everything's turned on, so it doesn't matter. But eventually later on, you have this information. This is the alpha channel, which is what's transparent and what's not. You can put a different background in pretty easily. We'll talk about that later, but in this case, it'll save the red, green, blue channels together, and that's pretty much it. So yeah, there's a few commands in there that you can get, but that'll get you through most of today, at least to kind of understand what VRay is doing. There's tons of materials, built in to VRay, and you can kind of play with them. There's even some things that make things look tune things. They make kind of things like wireframes that are kind of interesting. If I can call this up here. Yeah. It's like a wireframe material. Will actually show you all the curves and the edges of things, which is kind of cool. Some of the, there's like liquids. I think there's like orange juice and wine. Don't make your building out of orange juice, please. Like, if you think about architectural materials, you can even make a version of your model that looks like a cardboard or a paper model. Like, that would be interesting. And you've got things like wood, laminate you can experiment with. Don't make things out of crystal or anything like that. The other thing you're going to want to do too is you're going to want to break this model down into more pieces and organize it a little bit better. Right now it's just walls and glass and really there's no actual ground. That's going to be something that you're going to want to work with. So really break this thing down more. If you look at the ground, you have asphalt. I would not mess with grass right now, please. The way it renders takes a lot of memory and it takes a lot of time, and it's not something you necessarily want to play with for this assignment. Emissive materials are things that glow, and they can be kind of interesting, but they're also things I don't want you to play with necessarily for this assignment. Um, brick is fine. You can tile with it. Glass, metal. You make parts of the building out of metal. We just kind of develop a realistic architectural palette. Like don't do stuff that's too crazy. But later on, go for it. Like experiment with things. I think some of the kind of emissive materials might make for some interesting models. Like if you have something that's made out of neon or glows, might be kind of cool. Um, but at least for this, like I'd like you guys to check that a bit before you go too crazy. Anyway, I hope that helps. Let us know if you have questions. Pay attention to the parameters of the assignment. We want 9 renderings total. That's 3 renderings. 3 different views with 3 different material palettes each. So the same view, but 3 different sets of materials. And I think it's really going to help you, like I said, if you can break down your project into more layers, like infill panels or walls or horizontals versus verticals or frames around windows, like all that kind of stuff like that. The other thing I want to mention too is like you kind of have a pool here, which is kind of interesting. You might do something with that, like with reflections. You can also go into VRay and you can make an infinite plane. An infinite plane is kind of nice because it gives you it makes sure that you always have a horizon. And it's one of the ways of like preventing your model from looking like it's just falling off the edge of the world, which juries like hate. It's not. It doesn't look very realistic. It'll also help you with that like horizon problem when you're viewing your model. Let me try to get the. No, I don't want that. Stop. If I go back to the asset editor and I go back to the interactive render, yeah, I can probably do that. Yeah. You can see that it gives me at least it goes off to the edge, and you can make that some color or some kind of ground. But I will note, and you'll find this out quickly that the ground does not quite match. I mean this is kind of moves a bit in section, like it's a little bit off of the quote unquote ground. Yeah, it has a bit of sort of like topography, so you might need to adjust that, or at least get to a place where you're not going to see that. So just be very careful with that. Again, you'll figure it out. Look at that; it's basically infinite, though. It's kind of crazy. And let's see here. Oops. Yeah. So if you get lost, you can just use a zoom selected to get you back on. But look around this building. There's lots of different spaces in it. There's a front and a back, if you can call this a back. You can kind of look at this negative space between areas. There's also stairs in a space. I realize I'm kind of flying around quickly here. I might make this too dark right now, but oh, and I zoomed in. Ah, that's kind of neat. Yeah. So experiment, with the space itself. Maybe try to look out one of these balconies from somewhere. I gave you guys that one camera, but I think you guys could probably find a better view, and I would like you to. Okay, good luck. We'll be around to help you guys if you need it. Thanks.